You've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest-running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanagh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh, here with an all-star cast, as always, part of our virtual summit. If you missed the webinar portion, look for it on our channel, on our YouTube channel, on Inside Analysis. But today's topic, data observability on blast. And it is on blast. My goodness, I don't know if I've seen too many spaces blow up as fast as observability. Oh, I guess I actually do. Big data, and then, of course, ChatGPT. So things are going fast these days. They're blowing up quickly. Why is that happening? Well, I would argue that one reason is because of this amazing thing called Kubernetes. But the other reason is just that we have an incredibly complex world these days, folks. We are living in the information age. We're living in the cloud age. And we're living in the multi-cloud and the hybrid cloud age. And of course, we've got the edge too. So you have all of these landscapes that we're trying to fuse together as people hop online and try to buy stuff at e-commerce sites, as people go on social media and try to share thoughts and ideas and go back and forth. Well, there are lots of engineers in the background hacking away, trying to figure out why the site is loading slowly, why this service request didn't go through, all the troubleshooting stuff. The SREs, as they're called, site reliability engineers, those folks are working nonstop to make sure that stuff is working out okay. So observability comes along and allows you to get leading indicators that there are problems. And that's really the key. You want to know early, before something blows up. You want to get some indication. So I often reference observability as kind of like IoT for data. So if you think about what happened in Ohio next to us a number of months ago with that train that derailed with all that toxic stuff on there, well, apparently there's a wheel bearing that was bad, and this wheel was just burning up and ultimately just popped off and caused a horrible, terrible problem. Well, if you had sensors all around, and you do need a lot of them, you need them all over the place. But if you had sensors around there, they would say, hey, something is getting hot here. Stop the train. Let's work on this problem. That's what these sensors do. And you've seen that in the manufacturing space now for probably 30 years, quite frankly. Some really powerful machine learning algorithms have been used for years, for a long time in the manufacturing space, because you kind of need that stuff. So jet engines, for example, you can tell when one particular part starts to go bad, and they even will use sound. You can use the sound coming from an engine, because if it starts to rattle or hum in a different way, that's an indication that something has gone wrong. Just like your car. If your car's brakes start squeaking, that's because they got wet. If they're going like this, it's because the pads are burned down. Like, these are indications. In that case, the sensor is really just your body hearing this stuff. But what you want to have are sensors that allow you to understand what's happening. Did some data feed stop? Is there a new column in this feed? Is there a new column in this data set, for example, that I need to watch out for? When you make those kinds of changes, or you have things like data drift, right? If the world is changing around you and you're not changing accordingly, something is drifting and you want to stay on top of that. So data observability helps us with all of these different tasks, with all these different things. And let's bring in our first guest here. We just did a webinar with you, a keynote. Bhaskar Sunkara, you should know a thing or two about this. He was CTO at AppDynamics, which was bought by Cisco for $3.6 billion, was it? How much was
3.7, yeah.
3.7,
yeah.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is.
So tell us about your history with performance management, application performance management, and how you started Bicycle and what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my career with performance monitoring at a company called Wiley. So this was back in 2005. And Wiley was a pioneer in doing bytecode instrumentation to do performance monitoring. So what they would do is, at that time, Java was the most popular framework to build applications. Applications weren't as distributed back then as they are now. And so they'd be like 10 servers, 15 servers, etc. And what Wiley would do is insert its own bytecode into those applications, into those Java programs, and collect metrics out of them, push them to a dashboard, correlate them a little bit, and say, hey, here's what you need to pay attention to. Here's the queries that are not doing well. Here's the code that's not performing well. And so that's how it created that category. So that's when I started. Spent about 3 years there, and in 2008 we started App Dynamics. I was one of the founders and the CTO. And the big part of why we did that was applications were becoming very distributed, and so using code and queries as a proxy for, is my business performing healthy, in a healthy way? Because at the end of the day, that's really what you really care about. It's not about like, is it some part of the application, is it some query, but are you sort of like delivering the right user experience? Are people able to log in? Are people able to search? Are people able to do their bookings, etc. On the website? So that's the core of what App Dynamics came up with. It came up with this operating construct called the business transaction that represented user experience, right? So instead of saying, here's how my code is working, here's how queries are working, here's how CPU is working, it bound it all together into some context saying, hey, here's how many searches are happening and here's how searches are performing. It would then also baseline historical search performance, because searches would perform differently on a Monday versus a Tuesday versus like in the morning and on the weekend. So we did a lot of the auto thresholding, auto baselining. And so we brought a lot of automation into that world. And so that's kind of really the core of it. Towards the end of App Dynamics, we basically did a product called Business IQ, which started looking at what is the impact of a performance issue, right? So when a performance issue happened, who were impacted? Like, are these my super important customers? Are these my new customers? What's the cohort? So on and so forth. So that's a simple use case, but a lot of segmentation based on some impact. So that was kind of the genesis of what I wanted to do, into the future, because I kind of looked at, just tooling, and looked at, there is operational tooling, which is focused on live and streaming data. And then there's like analytical tooling that's more based off of dashboards. And these two need to combine together, because it needs to be, and talk more about this point later, but it needs to be sort of insight driven. And when you're insight driven, you're impact first, and that helps you make the right decision, and helps you sort of like really orient towards the priority of the business, which is kind of really the only thing that matters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you mentioned how the world was becoming more federated, and apps are becoming more federated, and that becomes more true by the day, it seems to me. And the different environments where you can build things. So now Snowflake, for example, has rolled out their, I think they call it Unistore or something like that, where they're allowing you to build out applications using them. And it was originally for data warehousing, but now they're thinking of no, let's go ahead and enable a next generation of apps. So that's a whole new environment to build apps in. You can build apps on Databricks. You can build apps with traditional databases. I mean, there's like no end to the ways you can do things. And in a truly connected world, we just heard this F-35 plane might have been hacked. I mean, they don't know exactly what happened there. That's kind of scary stuff. But if you rely on any connection to the outside world through the internet, well, someone can get in there, right? I mean, so we're in very challenging times. I almost think that it's great that we have all this new technology, but it's almost like just in time. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the just in time factor and the amount of things, and again, I think that's what lends it to start thinking about, handing over some of this to machine learning, because when you look at sort of the impact, when you look at causality for an insight and processing an insight, it is just not simply something that analysts can do, because you just need a ton of context to process and a ton of correlation to do and come up with, hey, this is the right action, this is what needs to be done, or even to explain why something is happening. Right, because there's all these seasonality. There's all this sort of like, if you take retail, for example, there's sort of like all this seasonality with respect to Thanksgiving and Black Friday, Cyber Monday, etc. There's all this context, right? There's regional holidays, etc. And so, how do you actually account for all that context? And that's where I think machine learning can help a lot.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny, since you brought that out. Before we bring in our next guest, I'll just throw an observation out. I remember researching this. It was like back in the year 2000 that Yahoo and some of the other big engines at the time were really focused on how to scale up, right? Because back in the old days, you just had to provision as many servers as you would need for peak. which is not a very cost-effective way to do things, because then when peak is gone, you only need a fraction of that. You're still paying all this money out the yin-yang. And we've really kind of cracked that code, right? We can scale up now very effectively, and we can even scale down pretty effectively. What are your thoughts about progress on that phase, being able to scale down effectively? Is that as easy as scaling up now?
No, I think there's been a lot of work. Like, I think if you remember the initial auto scaling pieces that were delivered by Amazon. So, for example, Netflix used to be one of our early customers at App Dynamics, and they had really basic ways of scaling up and scaling down, saying, "Hey, if CPU is more than this, then scale up. If CPU is less than this, then scale down." But from those days, there's been a lot of progress on automatically scaling, and there's so much other sort of progress in that area with analytics on cloud costs and cloud usage and everything else. And now that's starting to get a lot more automated, where people can make better decisions based on their usage and seasonality. And also a lot of pricing is gone the consumption way. So that kind of forces people to really just say, hey, I'm just like, because it's by the hour, by the minute. So people are compelled to make that area a lot better because they need to figure out saving those costs.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, let's bring in our buddy Chris Krishnan out there from Sixth Sense Advisors. You've been in this space for a long time, and you've kind of seen how we've made tremendous advances, and then the world gets more complex. Then we make advances, the world gets more complex. We're at one of those inflection points now, it seems to me, and data observability is a big part of the equation, because we can see now we can understand what's really happening on all these different front lines, and then do some heavy lifting to figure out how that's going to affect us in the business. What are your thoughts on this evolution and the role that data observability plays?
Absolutely, Eric. The pieces that we heard Bhaskar talk about, and then you gave a commentary on some of the early on pieces of what we saw in the industry, lead us to look at two very important things from now into 2024, the next 3-4 months. What I'm looking at is, one, the explosion of LLMs and the explosion of ML-driven algorithms mean that you need data quality to be checked, verified, validated before it can be put into any of those engines.
Oh, right.
So if we want to do modern day media, for example, you want to have a valid signature stamp on news sources and verified driven information, not just some random observed information that just creeps along. In the old world, it was a different issue. But in what we are living in today, into the next iteration of where we want to go, we need observability to be there with monitoring so that we can smell, sniff, and arrest incorrect, invalid data, thereby preventing catastrophic decisions to be driven into the business. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect, which is going to be very interesting, this is extremely important for everybody in the world to know, is when you go to the cloud, be assured that you will see this word observability come up in your checklist as you migrate into the cloud. It didn't come up so far, but at this point, we have arrived at a tipping point where in the multi-cloud hybrid environment, you will need observability way ahead of the curve in order to be very efficient as you operationalize on the cloud. So that is where I'm looking at this becoming the linchpin, if you will, for success.
Yeah, you made a really good point here around data quality and the critical importance of good data quality for feeding machine learning algorithms, for feeding your AI, because you get this error propagation issue where maybe it's a small error when it goes in, but by the time it comes out, it's a big error. And that's going to cause all kinds of problems. I mean, I think that there are a number of vendors in this space. It's not really the observability space. It's really the discovery space that are coming into play now to help organizations look at what they have and catalog what they have,
Yep.
not just like a data catalog, but is this sensitive information? Is this customer information? What is this stuff? I mean, some of these data centers are like 40 years old. And it's only recently that we've had the technology to be able to scan that environment to see what it is.
Yep.
So, there's a whole lot going out there. And if you flip the switch on AI before you've cleaned up your data, it's going to be a rough ride. What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah,
1,000% yes, but I want to see what Yves and Bhaskar would say about that.
All right, we'll give Yves 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Go.
Already so much said. I think definitely with you had a good point, Eric, is that the data centers are so old, and having that observability on what is really happening. I think we've mentioned it before. This needs to be aligned about the continuous insights related to the business insights, where before it was really disconnected. You had the IT part where you had some agents looking into consumption of your hardware and all your resources, and you had the business sides where you had the dashboards and the KPIs, but nothing what was really related in such a close way. And I think that's the way where we are going together with the algorithms that can help you in spot patterns and advise you. And hey, isn't there something wrong? Maybe it's coming from the technical system, and maybe it's coming from the business insights. And then point out and having an easy way of finding the complete path from your sources, from your resources, from the data, up to how you defined your business context and the semantics which are out there. So yeah, I'm pretty excited of where we are going, and not purely on the technical monitoring of systems, but really, if we call it data observability, but I think business observability would be a better word to talk about.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, observability literally just means being able to see something, and now we can see into the pipes. Imagine your plumbing system in your house, right? I remember covering a story 32 years ago in my newspaper days. A company called In Situ Form came along. They came up with a very clever way of fixing pipes by just spraying a polymer into the pipe, right? So they just go in there and it fixes all the little spots. But if you could see in there, if you had little windows to understand where is the clog, because if you don't have that, well, guess what? If you're a plumber and you can't figure out where there's a stoppage in 200 feet of pipe going around a house, you're going to have some problems. That's when they start using the wires that they stick in there until it stops. And oh my goodness, it's going to cost you what, $75, $100 an hour. So they figured that out. Well, in the enterprise, it's costing you $75,000 to $100,000 an hour to fix some of these problems. So that's probably why they figured it out. But we'll be right back, folks. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, All-Star Cast as always, talking to Bhaskar Sunkara from Bicycle, formerly from App Dynamics, Chris Christian of 6 Sense Advisors, and Yves Mulkers from 7W Data, of course. And Yves, we were talking to you before the break hit, and we're just talking about how important it is to have data observability. It's really table stakes these days if you want to be leveraging some of the newer architectures. And let's get back to that whole issue around morale. I was saying, I think in the break there, predictive maintenance is great stuff because it boosts morale. And, there's nothing more frustrating being a troubleshooter who can't troubleshoot because he or she can't get the data that they need to even know where to begin. It's like looking for your wallet in the house that you can't find. You don't even know if it's in the house. Is it maybe across the street at my friend's house where I was last night? Is it in the car? It's very demoralizing if you don't even know where to begin looking for this stuff. So data observability is like it's on the front end of knowing what's happening and being able to prevent catastrophic errors that are going to take your data team down. So you invest all this money in a data warehouse or some data product, and if it falls down, if it falls over, I remember learning in the printing press business a long time ago, 30 odd years ago, from the guys who run the printing presses, and they explained to me, look, when these machines aren't running, we are not making money, and that's a big problem. In fact, one of my vendors actually bought a Heidelberg press when it came out, the new 4-color press. It was $1 million for this press that would just crank stuff out. So he died of a heart attack. But I'll throw it back over to Yves to comment on the importance of observability and really how we are turning a corner here. What do you think, Yves?
Yeah, there is no question about it. We need to be able to observe all the systems, but your business performance as well into one complete flow from the beginning where it originates until your continuous insights. I think we had Bhaskar mentioned it before, the continuous insights, and this is really, I think it's a good pronunciation. If you think about it, we're always talking about streaming data, but it's the technical part and not the business insights. So you have your technical thing, which is important. It's like running your car. It needs to bring you until your endpoint. But if you don't make it in time, that's something you want to know just to inform the people with whom you have an appointment as such. And as well of seeing, like you say, just the predictive maintenance, understanding your systems. If something will break, or you need a system that needs to scale because you anticipate seasonality or whatever happens to have an extra load. If you can foresee that, you can build so much more flexible systems, which will be cost optimization. Time to market will decrease. A lot of opportunities if we have that in hand. But very smart systems that augment everybody that is using the systems and the business processes.
I realized I was on mute. Bhaskar, you made a really good point in the keynote earlier today, talking about how you realize that you have to verticalize to really thrive in this environment. And the reason is because to take some of these models and try to take a generic model and apply it to everyone, there's way too much customization work that's going to be necessary. It's almost like you get 30% out of the box and you need to customize 70%. That takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. You know, I think one of the biggest hindrances to innovation is like the classic innovator's dilemma, right? Like I'm just trying to do what I have to get done. And if I'm behind the 8 ball all the time, I can't do anything new. Well, could you explain why it's important to verticalize and what takes a lot of time if you don't?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing I feel like when you have a solution and when a team or when multiple teams in an enterprise start using it, it's all about adoption. You know, especially with something like data or observability or anything operational, it's all about whether the company is able to adopt the tool and start using it day to day. And if the learning curve is super high, if there's a lot of effort going into it, if you have to bring in professional services from a company to get it done, the results are not that great. So if you look at like some of the most successful, tools or platforms in the past, the reason Datadog was so successful, right? Like that was sort of something that came after AppDynamics and then really took over the market. It's because it's out of the box, right? Like, so you didn't have to go in and say, oh, I'm going to create a dashboard for my cloud metrics. I'm going to create a dashboard for my infrastructure metrics. It was all there, right? So the equivalent of combining streaming and context is to sort of start bringing in the context of a vertical. So if you're doing e-commerce, then it's pretty obvious that, revenue by products, or if you're doing some sort of supply chain delivery, whether they're delivery metrics or conversion in some sense, all of those are table stakes that need to be sort of easier to implement, easier to set up. So platforms need to become more insight driven on this is what is going to be delivered and how do you align everything around it. So I'm a big believer in user experience is really like the biggest moat that you can have, because that's what really fuels adoption. That's what has sort of like a successful platform, and a big part of especially moving up the value chain and starting to look at business observability or looking at AI insights where you're automatically interpreting insights is the vertical part of it. And that's one of the reasons why we're focusing on specific segments like travel and fintech, and e-commerce. Yeah.
Well, those are also very, very data intensive
Absolutely.
industries, right? And not just data intensive, but time intensive, right? You look at
Absolutely.
travel, like you have to be able to enable people. And I'm still kind of surprised, despite all this
Yeah.
AI, maybe I'll throw this over to Krishnan to get your thoughts on it. Despite the tremendous amount of technologies that we have these days, being able to scrape prices from lots of different sources and using Kayak and Orbitz and all these guys, it is still a pain in the rear end to book travel. I mean, you know what I'm talking about? It's like, why haven't we cracked that nut? I think that's going to be one of the use cases around these AI assistants is like, look, I want to go to Florida in November. I don't want to pay more than $500 total. And I want you to just find me that flight. And when you find I just booked that darn thing, it's for me and the wife, etc. Boom. And just set it and forget it. And you just wait. And then one day, ding, here's your flight. We found it. I think that's coming, but I don't know, man. There may be some more problems in the way. But what do you think, Chris?
Oh, the desire for a personalized AI assistant, that's what you're asking for, saying, hey, here is my rules, if you would, in a rules execution phase, which is ticket shouldn't be over 500. It should be from this time to this time in a day. I prefer these 3 airlines. I prefer premium economy, or I prefer business class, and book it when you find it. You're going to have a personalized AI agent, and that can execute what you want. The question is what are the guardrails, which is the newest term you're hearing in the LLM space now, which is a combination of data observability as well as data governance from a data rule perspective, as well as your business rule perspectives that you want to put. The guardrails around that AI assistant. Who's going to execute that? Where is it going to be? Is it a service from the cloud? Is it a service from a tool vendor or a set of tool vendors together that's going to license it to you? And will it solve this same use case? How many times will you book travel like that? You book it once, twice, great. You book it every month, fantastic. You book it once every 2 years. So that is where the applicability of that specific set of asks becomes questionable. But where I see this coming through real time is where Bhaskar was talking about fintech, healthcare. The cloud explosion will drive these specifics to have those guardrails built in, those tool segments built in, and then check the box as you offer them as services. I'm seeing this beginning to start taking shape, in fact, with LinkedIn quite a bit. I'm seeing YouTube taking shape quite a bit. So these are all the segments where you will see the flutter of activity, and then boom, in comes the big ones. You will see that coming through, but it's a guardrail system setup when it comes to how this will get implemented. But it's coming within the next 18 months, given guarantee.
Yeah, and Bhaskar, maybe I'll bring you back in. If you're trying to observe, like we mentioned, real user monitoring, basically, just trying to understand what someone is doing out there, knowing the difference between human beings and bots has got to be one of the biggest challenges out there today. And now that we have all this AI-generated content and AI-generated activity, that's going to get even harder. What are your thoughts about just being able to discern between what's real and what's AI-driven? That's a pretty big challenge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know how Elon keeps talking about that all the time with Twitter. So even the best of the best, with that kind of workforce and that kind of technology, have issues in figuring out what's really happening. Are the posts being done by real people, or is it just bots out there? And how many accounts are real? How many accounts are fake? So it is a huge problem to be able to kind of do that. And I feel like, especially with the way the risk for something like cybersecurity is, that kind of problem is super prevalent, and it needs to be part of addressing the overall holistic solution, for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and speaking of holistic, I'll throw this to you, and then I'll bring Yves in maybe. It's so funny when I look at if you look at the behaviors and the desired outcomes and the patterns of data and functionality, et cetera, security, governance, compliance are all very, very similar. They're all trying to solve for the same things, and yet we still have a security team, which is siloed from a governance team, which is siloed from a compliance team. I feel like tools like yours in particular are going to help bring those people together because it's kind of the same thing that you're doing, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can actually take an example of how that can be done. And I also want to tie back a point that Chris was making. So he was making a point in terms of the quality of data and how LLMs can help with it. And to his point, honestly, like the quality of what ML can get you is completely based on the quality of data. That's number one, right? Then the point that Yves was making was just sort of business observability. And in terms of business observability, I think it's sort of moving up the value chain. So if you think about it, and I'll come back to your original question, but if you think about it, like a company kind of looks at their core KPIs, their OKRs, their SLAs, and things like that. So I feel that at some point, observability will start looking at layers like that, and entities like that, which is, it's looking at like the goals you have to achieve as an organization. It's looking at the KPIs or the OKRs that you have to achieve as an organization, and then telling you whether you're on track or not, right? And to your point, the discipline of security, compliance, governance, etc., has to be also insight driven. If you're insight driven, then you can also, for the security team, for the compliance team, for the governance, because those are all specialized disciplines. Not anybody can come in and sort of start doing that. It also gives them a way of organizing and prioritizing what is being impacted and what to sort of work with, because otherwise it's a very horizontal type of problem without a lot of context. And I think making it more insight driven, where you're kind of talking about, well, this particular security problem, this particular data quality problem even is impacting this particular OKR or insight that needs to be sort of, monitored. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It helps organize your activity. And this gets back to something I talked about last year, which is understanding your priorities. Like, what do you work on right now?
Correct.
Right.
It's the biggest thing.
It's a real challenge, because especially in this world where you're troubleshooting and you're problem solving, because you got tickets coming in all the time, man, all the time. It's a constant flood of tickets. There are always problems. How do you triage those? How do you organize those? And then to your point earlier, let the machine learning do some of that stuff. Take the low hanging fruit, let the bots handle that, and let the real people handle the more complex problems, right?
Correct. Absolutely. The one that's more nuanced.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, again, it gets back to morale. Maybe Yves, I'll throw this over to you. And Yves loves to play around with new technologies because that's fun. It's fun to do that. It's not fun to solve, Jira tickets to come in and more and more and more. It's the same problem again. Have you turned it off and on again? I do think that we're turning the corner, but I mean, it's still so complex. I don't envy any CDO or CTO or CIO out there. These people have real nerves of steel. What do you think, Yves?
Yeah, I think so in some ways, but we touched upon a few of these topics. And what pops up to my mind is constantly context. So depending on what you want to know about your systems and the warnings, what you want to get, it's not the same for everybody in each and every situation. And I think definitely with the new technology, with AI, this is where we can go, and you can personalize it on what you want to see, what you want to know. It's like getting a newsletter, and you can already mark down that you want to receive it once a week or twice a week or in a few months or something like that. And I was thinking it the same way.
Let's pick this up after the break. We'll pick this up after the break. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to Yves Mulkers, Krish Krishnan, and Bhaskar Sunkara. And Yves, we cut you off at the end of the last segment there. You were talking about the importance of context, and it really is incredibly important, because context is something that most people take for granted, But you go to a baseball game, you're at the baseball game, you understand the context, so you expect what's happening next. If you're at a hockey game, you expect for there to be a fight soon. I mean, these things in context really do help you understand what to look for, and that's the key. So you know what to look for, but how many different contexts can a system absorb and understand, and what's a reasonable number? So these are difficult things to ascertain. It actually goes back to a question I had asked from Bhaskar at the beginning of this or during the webinar before we did this, is like, how do you get at least a foothold to start somewhere? And he was saying, well, you start with what's important to the business, like your platinum customers. Let's just look at them instead of looking at just the sort of data landscape or the tech landscape. No, let's look at the clients who pay us money, understand what systems they're hitting, what data they need, and kind of work from there. I think that's probably the smartest thing to do. What do you think, Yves?
Yeah, there is a valid point in there. It starts with the business and not purely business people as such, but your business strategy. What do you want to achieve as a company? What are your targets? What is important? Is your customer experience most important? Is it the delivery of products? Those kind of questions. And I was thinking during our conversations about, for example, if you see how Amazon runs their e-commerce web shop, they have all kind of triggers in place to assure that the stock levels are up to place, the delivery rates and whatever. So either everybody that is selling through Amazon's web shops, they can get penalized if their stock inventory is not up to a level. All kind of things that Amazon can assure that the user experience and the delivery is up to their SLAs. And I think maybe it's a bit too constrained, but that's a good way to go, where you say, what do I want to achieve as a company? And then based upon that, boil back onto the systems and whatever helps you achieve that. That's why, for example, if you're doing evaluation of your employees, you have targets as well, or I would prefer to say guardrails in which boundaries you can work. And if we go in that direction on all the levels, I mean, human beings, employees in your space, the systems, but as well how your business runs, and we can combine that, then yeah, definitely technology will help us become a better world.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And Bhaskar, maybe I'll throw it back over to you. Again, what I get excited about is how observability can help an organization redesign and optimize their information systems, right? Like figure out where do we need to add resource, where do we need to add capacity, where do we need to add people? That's another pretty important thing these days. Like, how many more people do we need in this department? How do we organize that department? Let the observability give you lots of indicators about that so that you're designing for the ideal consumption, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really setting up a practice around that, like, and then and that'll guide you as you sort of get more mature around that. That'll, to your point, it'll guide you about like how big it needs to be, how much attention do I need to pay for it, just pay to it, just with how it's a part of your business strategy, right? Like that's kind of the way I look at it. The one example, just building on Yves, I want to just share an example with one of the customers we were working with in terms of how the context part is important, and how also being on time. And if context is not on time, it's kind of not it's totally useless, right? So with one of the companies we were working with, they had they were selling sort of hotel rooms, and they had a bunch of like hotel rooms that they wanted to promote with some of their brands, and they were gonna kick it off one of the days, and then the dev team basically forgot to update those brands into their the caching infrastructure, and as a result, nobody was booking their rooms, right? But the point is, the software teams, the software data doesn't reflect it, because it doesn't really care about like what brands are being booked, what is really happening, and is the data you're collecting lining up to the goals of the business, right? Like, because again, that's sort of detached from each other. So it also tells you context is super important, and it also needs to be on time. Like that's the other point I was going to make.
That's a great case study. It's a great example, because it shows you that with a traditional horizontal or even vertical view of the world, you're not going to see that because it's not triggering the usual alerts. But there's a business function that needs to be served, which is not being served at all. And
Correct.
having no visibility into that is going to give you a blind spot. That's what it is. It's a blind spot, right?
It's a blind spot. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, blind spots are no good, especially when you're trying to book hotel rooms and make sure you guarantee.
For sure. Yeah,
there's some problems that you can solve quickly. There's some problems that you cannot solve quickly. And if you need a big ramp to solve it, then you need the time to climb the ramp to solve it.
To climb the ramp.
Right.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's like, boom, you're in trouble.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's interesting. Well, Yves, maybe I'll throw it over to you for some closing comments here. I mean, you've been a consultant, an analyst, an end user. You play around with all these different technologies. Again, what gets me excited is thinking about this next generation of AI tools that should be able to absorb even a sampling of network traffic and then start telling you some interesting things about what's going on in your environment. I think that's going to be the next wave of analytics and of insight, and observability is a big part of that, because if you have observability, if you know where data is coming from, if you know what it's doing, what it's not doing, that's going to allow you to leverage these new AI engines. But what do you think, Yves?
Yeah, we brought it up before, the new technologies. If you see what we can now do with the large language models, it's the layered approach. And like you mentioned, Eric, you have your network, you have your resources, you have your infrastructure, and all the different things for supporting the business in such a way. I was thinking you can look at it as a HIS application, geoinformation system, and where you have the various layers, and depending on what you want to see, you see either the high level perspective of what is happening, or you go deep down on to see maybe the waterways or the road, whatever you want to see. But you have various layers that are put upon each other. And then I can go even further. For example, if I'm driving to work or to a client, the days that I'm not driving, I'm not interested into the traffic jams that are out there. So I don't want to have a warning because I stay at home and I'm not traveling. And if we can contextualize that's what I mean with having the context in whenever it's needed, then you want to get these warnings. And for the rest, you trust the system that it runs like it should run, and you don't want to get these signals about that. And definitely with AI and the large language models, we're coming pretty close on having that holistic approach really at scale and the capabilities of doing that even in real time.
Yeah, you made a really good point there about not wanting the traffic signals. I remember, gosh, this is 6 or 7 years ago. I usually work out of my house, but for a short period of time, I was going to an office space in New Orleans. And all of a sudden, I got this alert on my phone from Google said, "Oh, traffic is light at this point in time." I'm thinking, why is it saying that? And I was like, oh, because it noticed that I'm going to this location every week. Now, that's pretty interesting stuff. I mean, so you figure you have to have a profile on me because it's me going there at this particular point in time. And I'm like, wow. That's kind of powerful that it's been monitoring me and it's sensing this. Now, of course, you have to opt in, say I'll do this, but click here to say that you have read and understand the term agreements. Has anyone ever read the whole thing? Like, are you kidding? Don't make me a liar, dude. I don't understand it. I mean, good grief. But still, that's a perfect example because I'm not traveling. That's what happened to me that day. It's like, well, I'm not. Oh, that's why it's doing it, because it's watching me all the time. That goes to show you there's a lot of that's observability. I mean, Google has observability into where I move around town on a daily basis. Wow. Well, we got 1 minute left. Closing thoughts from Bhaskar. What should if your audience takes away anything, what do they take away from you from Bicycle?
No, I feel like the future is that how do you combine analytics, verticalization and observability. So I feel like analytics and verticalization, especially using LLMs, gives you a very, very clean model on based on your business, also apply it to things like data quality, et cetera, and then hand it over to data observability, because then it has context of what is it observing, what's the streams of data, what do they mean, what do they layer up to? And it's really about how you combine all these three things together, and that's what sort of, I feel like, makes up like a really good practice.
Yeah, that's great advice. LLMs, analytics, and observability, right? These three together, they're the three rails now that are going to hold together something interesting. And I got to tell you, folks, the portal is opening. That's what's happening here with these large language models, with AI, with observability. The portal is opening. We need to walk through the portal to get to the other side of the new way of doing things, and cross your T's, dot your I's. You're going to be okay. But otherwise, if you're not moving, if you're not preparing to move, things are going to get really weird really fast. Well, folks, thanks so much for your time today. Look us up online. You've been listening to DM Radio.